Hello everyone, it's Sakiziel here. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today, I'll be reacting to The Damocles Gulf Crusade by Old Man Lore Stories and Theory. And as always, I highly recommend that you check out Old Man's content if you aren't doing so already. He is a both entertaining and informative way of presenting the lore, and a link to the original video will be in the description box below. But without further ado, let's see what he has to say about the Tau's first encounter with the larger Imperium.
In the year 789 M25, an Adeptus Mechanicus exploration ship named Lens Vision discovered a desert world near the eastern fringes in the Ultima Segmentum in the galactic north. Upon surveying the barren world, they discovered a primitive race of Xenos inhabiting the planet, fighting wars amongst themselves with spears and bows. There was nothing overtly remarkable about the planet, and, as with many other worlds within the eastern fringe, it was marked for colonization, while the Xenos were marked for extermination. Len's vision moved on, continuing to catalog and survey worlds to discover any places of material worth. During its travels, word reached Len's vision that an event swiftly becoming known as the Age of Apostasy was underway, around the same time that long-range sensorium and astrotelepathic readings discovered that the desert world they had not long ago departed was now enveloped by a warp storm. Even as Gog Van Dyer's reign of blood began, the report on the desert world and its Xeno species was logged and filed. The Imperium had far greater concerns on its hands.
Shut your fucking mouth! No problem, John. Shut the fuck up, you cunt! Shut it!
Colony ships were sent to the planets in the areas suitable for settlement. Even the minor forces needed to eradicate a Stone Age Xeno species were seen as more needed in other areas of the galaxy at large. With wars raging, the backwater worlds so recently colonized by the Imperium gradually lost all contact, becoming lost colonies that simply vanished from the concerns of the Imperium altogether. The report of the land's vision remained in the records of the Ministratum, forgotten.
I know about how the Imperium loses worlds regularly and regains them almost as regularly. So it's like, oh, like some world out on the fringes, we've lost contact with them. That's a normal occurrence. And maybe in the next 1,000 years, a fleet will actually make the way over there to see what happened and to recolonize the world.
As the Age of Apostasy continued within the Imperium, the forgotten world of the Xenospecies who called themselves the Tau continued to tear itself apart. The endless civil strife came to a head at the fortress city of Theotome, where the hatred between the two sides had reached a tipping point. 5 years had passed with the inhabitants of the city defending themselves with primitive cannons, but the siege was taking its toll. The attackers from the plains surrounding the city would settle for nothing less than the total annihilation of the city itself and all the population within. In one day, within a few hours actually, both sides put down their weapons and agreed to talk. The cause of this drastic turn was the appearance of two Tau, one of which went to the camp of the Plains Warriors and the other simply walked into the city. The two sides, who had been fighting for 5 years and were both determined to wipe out the other, simply allowed these two strangers into their camp and city, and then within hours the war was over.
What? What the fuck?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Tu Tao walked into a camp that had been besieging a city for 5 years, and the city that was been besieged for 5 years, and just walked in there with no one stopping them, and managed to talk both sides into coming to the table and stop fighting. That is how mythologically full of crap the Ethereals are. I'm not even sure why I keep on talking about this. The Tau are hardly even a threat to the most undermined backwater world, and the only reason that anybody ever considers them a threat to any Imperial loyalty is because of the fact that the Watercast keeps on putting up pictures of big titty Tau Fire warriors when the only people that it would draw away from the Imperium at large is fucking heretics. And if you want to know what I think, Robote Gilliman needs to get off his fucking ass when he's doing the Indominus Crusade and just send the entire goddamn fleet over to Tau States and start exterminating every single bit of these blueberry.
I'm guessing the hospital or cut him off just now, or to make him take his blood pressure medication. I knew it. Also, that whole thing though about the two with you just walking into the camps of both sides isn't being allowed in it's like that's BS, but I believe it.
These two beings were the first known appearance of the Tau subspecies known as the Ethereals. The Ethereals began appearing in more areas within Tau society, and within a few years the entire race, which had spent its history at war with itself, was finally at peace. It is not truly known the method which the Ethereals have at their disposal to create this level of control, but several ideas have been presented. Whether it be pheromones, some low-level psychic ability, or something yet unseen, the hold the Ethereals have on the greater Tau society is absolute. Even the mere idea of disagreeing with an Ethereal is looked on with horror, and an Ethereal could order another Tau to kill themselves and be met with instant obedience. With this control in place, they quickly spread a doctrine that is known as the Greater Good. The Greater Good is the guiding force behind the Tau's attempts to conquer the galaxy, as well as keeping its own society together.
Also, oh, I like that he actually keeps bringing up these waifu depictions of the Tao, because it's kind of funny how well there have been some cases where Tao women and have been said to look almost exactly like the men, meaning they don't have breasts and they're either bald or at most have like I don't know a top knot, I guess you'd call it, that they turn into a ponytail.
The society itself was split into 5 separate castes: Fire, the Warriors caste; Earth, the Builders caste; Water, the Merchants, Diplomats, and Administrators; Air, the caste that makes up the Navy and interstellar merchant fleets.
I would say that she's too thick to be from the Aircast, because I've heard that they're lanky and tall as heck, and the Earthcast one was too tall because they're supposed to be short and stocky.
And finally, the Ethereals themselves. Alright, give me a few seconds here.
Sounds like he had to get the heavy bolter for that one. And one more for good measure, I take it.
After the invention and incorporation of the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine, as well as the final assimilation of the crew within the Tau Empire, The Ethereal Supreme, On Wei, believed the Empire was ready for a new phase of expansion. All Tau heads nodded in agreement. It was expected. The mere thought of disagreeing with the Ethereal was alien to them. From that point on, in the year 839, the Second Sphere expansion was underway. Over the course of a
Also, that whole thing, by the way, I find it kind of funny in the sense that well, the portrayals of the Tau that I'm most familiar with personally, are in the Dawn of War games, and I always found it funny how similar to what's mentioned, where the Tau would never think of disagreeing with the Ethereals for the most part, or that kind of comes across in the way they interacted with the other factions in the Dawn of War games. For example, whenever differences in ideology came up, the Tao is treated as the greater good being the correct way ahead. Like, they treat it as if it's something so obvious that everyone should just kind of like, everyone should just arrive at that conclusion, and that if you don't arrive at that conclusion, then you're just crazy.
For 1,000 years, the Tau expanded outwards, integrating several new species into their fold. On several worlds, the Tau found what appeared to be colonies containing a single species, calling themselves humanity. Members of the Water Caste, the diplomats of Tau society, listened to the legends that the natives of these worlds told, finding many similarities. They claimed to be descendants of colonists from a galaxy-spanning empire of immense power. These similarities were discarded by some. After all, these worlds were backwater at best, and most of them had even forgotten what world they had originated from. Irregardless, the worlds were quickly integrated into the Tau Empire, though debate raged on how they would address this empire. Some high-ranking members of the Fire Caste even opted for full-scale war of conquest against the Imperium.
You serious?
The ranking Ethereal Supreme, On Wei, disagreed. What was decided, after much deliberation, was a slow and steady.
The Tau really would actually fit in pretty well in the Mass Effect universe, just considering that, like, I'm willing to bet that they could probably get most of the Citadel races actually to at least be at peace with them, and via the efforts of the Water Caste.
Subversion and integration of the Imperial colonies. It must be remembered that at this time, the most dangerous opponent the Tau had faced was the Orcs, and even then, not even a fully fledged Wall. The Tau, upon first meeting the Orcs, attempted to absorb them into their empire. This went about as well as you'd expect it to go, with the Tau soon thereafter deciding the greater good dictated the total eradication of the Greenskin Mets. Go figure.
Yep, because if I remember correctly, it wasn't until the Tau encountered the Orcs that the concept of a race that could not be integrated into the Empire and converted to the greater good even occurred to them. So they invented a word to refer to them, and that word, if I remember correctly, is thus far only used to refer to the Orcs, the Tyranids, and I think the Dark Eldar.
The attitude of the Tau was one of calm superiority, believing that any faction they would meet would discover the merits of the greater good, or would simply be swept aside as easily they had the Orc tribes they had cleansed. For the Tau's sake, it was perhaps a much better fate that they decided to err on the side of caution, instead of attempting a full invasion. Otherwise, the Imperium might have taken them far more seriously at a time the Tau were not aware they could not afford the Imperium's attention. The Tau took and solidified holdings, and then looked at the large expanse of empty space between the Tau Empire's borders and the Imperium. It was known as the Damocles Gulf. Their ships skipped across the warp and arrived at what they believed to be the outer edges of Imperial space. During this time, they encountered captains of fleets known as rogue traders in the Imperium. who only reinforced the legends that the colonists on the other side of the Damocles Gulf had been telling the Tau for years. Watercast delegates were soon sent out into the Imperial Timbra subsector. What followed was a delicate set of diplomatic maneuverings, first establishing contacts, then trade agreements, attempting to subvert the loyalty of high-ranking Imperial officials. The seeds of a rebellion already had roots, being as far away as the colonies were from the Imperial center of attention. Most of these worlds received very little attention from the Imperium at all, as long as they provided their tithes. The Watercasts never pushed, only leaned gently, never applying pressure, and by 742 M41 the Watercasts had firmly asserted Tau dominance in Imperial space.
And that's why the Inquisition finds the Watercast be far more dangerous to the Imperium than the Firecast, despite it being the Firecast that's the military arm. Well, technically the Firecast and Iracast, since the Iracast are responsible for the Navy, but still.
Multiple planetary governors were ready to declare independence from the Imperium and join the Tau Empire. Imperial citizens on these worlds were already being indoctrinated into the Tau way of life, and Tau citizens lived next to humans, coexisting peacefully, as long as the humans subscribed to the greater good. In less than 100 years, the Tau were set to expand their territory by leaps and bounds. It did not seem they would have to fire a single shot to accomplish it. Fire warriors stood ready to rush in and take hold of these worlds, confident in their approach. After all, the Tau were operating under the greater good, and surely the Imperium would see that their member worlds would be much better off serving the Tau as valued citizens, and not the forgotten backwater worlds that they currently were. A few worlds simply stood at the brink of throwing off the shackles of the Imperium, standing ready to welcome the Tau with open arms. The Tau Empire saw great strides in their borders, and took it as a sign the greater good was destined to rule the galaxy, and not only that, the Tau would bring their philosophy to the galaxy with complete ease.
By the way, the armor being worn there in that piece of artwork, it reminds me so much of Protoss armor from StarCraft, to be honest.
It is said that, when you make a profound mistake, there is a moment of clarity that roots you to the place in which you stand, a moment that shocks you to your very core. In that moment, you understand that you have erred, and you will now be made to pay for your mistake.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Reports started arriving from the Watercast of a fleet of almost unimaginable power, closing in on the colonies of the Timbra subsector. One by one, the Imperial fleet went from world to world, pacifying them that had either already fallen or were on the verge of coming into the Tau Empire. Decades of painstaking work done by the Watercast ended abruptly. The Imperium was extremely thorough, and within months, worlds that had been on the verge of falling into the fold of the Tau were put well beyond reach. The Tau were left stunned at the brutality contained within the reports.
Yep, exactly. Realize that any major faction would wipe out your entire species with any real amount of effort.
Within days of the Imperial fleet arriving in the subsector, thousands, if not millions of Tau had been quite literally put to the sword. Within a few short months, the Imperial force had wiped out every Tau in the Timbra subsector, as well as any collaborators within the human population. Still reeling from this, the Tau learned that the Imperial fleet had left their own space, with its sights set on the Hydra sector. The Tau quickly mobilized for war. In 642 M41, almost 6,000 years after the land's vision found the Tau fighting each other to the death, a ship of unknown origin entered the Devlin system. After a few attempts at hails went unanswered, the local defense forces quickly destroyed the ship. The Imperium now knew of a Xenos race capable of traveling among the stars, and now the ancient report was dug up, finally. After testing the DNA from the corpses of the ruined ship, the Imperium quickly discovered that the pilots and crew of the vessels were, in fact, the primitive race encountered by the land's visioners. The gears of Imperial bureaucracy began to creak and slowly move, preparing for a military action to eradicate the Xenos. This preparation was quickly spurred, by Imperial standards at least, by the detachment of the Inquisition, who quickly discovered something alarming. The technological signature of the ship destroyed in Devlin had been found all along the fringe of what was known as the Damocles Gulf, not only in ships, but in trade goods as well as technology. The Inquisition determined that the species, now known as the Tau, was the culprit. On the planet of Brimlock, Cardinal Esau Gurney quickly began whipping the subsector into a religious frenzy upon hearing of the news. In 742 M41, the Cardinal declared a crusade to cleanse the galaxy of the Tau, and the call was answered. Even being given the name of the Damocles Gulf Crusade, the force barely fit the name, consisting of a fleet anchored by only a dozen capital-class warships of the Imperial Navy and 19 regiments of Imperial Guard.
Which is also why it is I've heard people will complain that while it's a crusade in function and name, that it's kind of disappointing in terms of numbers compared to prior crusades. But then again, and the Tau aren't that big of a threat, relatively speaking.
And almost half of those forces came from Brimlock itself. Of substantial more note were the 9 chapters of Adeptus Astartes who sent forces to the fight, resulting in a force of around 500 Space Marines, with the Iron Hand strike cruiser Fist of Light being called the flagship of the Astartes contingent.
Of course, the Iron Hand's flagship would have fist or some other reference to hand in its name. Because it's like, remember, Ferrus Manus, the Primarch of the Iron Hands, whose name means Iron Hand, who also has iron hands, and why Iron Hands give themselves Iron Hands to emulate his Iron Hands.
Even with this force included, the forces tasked with cleansing the Tau is without doubt one of the smallest military forces in Imperial history to ever be granted the title of Crusade. Without complaint or any further hesitation, the Imperial forces set out and quickly began pacifying worlds along the Damocles Gulf that had flared into rebellion over the last few years. The planets were swiftly brought back into order. All Xenos technology was seized and destroyed, and the Xenos found on the planet were exterminated. A special court was convened, and all that were found to be complicit in dealings with the Tau were put on trial. It is worth noting that during this trial, the judge, jury, and executioners were none other than the Crusaders themselves. Note that among the Crusaders there was a contingent of Black Templars. Given the previous statement, I don't feel like I need to specify what the fate of any who broke faith with the Imperium would have been.
That is because they are absolute lunatics.
Upon securing the totality of Imperial rule, the Crusade entered the Warp, their destination the Hydra system, and the official beginning of the Damocles Gulf Crusade. On one side, a small force sent to counter a pest which had appeared on the edge of concern. On the other side, the entire assembled might of its naval and ground forces. To the eyes of one empire, a threat barely worth noticing that had been forgotten 350 generations ago. To the eyes of the other, an extinction-level event beyond anything they had considered possible. The Tau rushed 7 of its cruisers to the Hydra system and prepared to meet the incoming force. Their objective was to follow standard Tau battle tactics and engage the Imperium at a standoff battle at long range, utilizing their formation and escorts to keep the Imperial ships at bay. Initially, the Imperial fleet was surprised at the capabilities of the long-range torpedo salvos of the Tau cruisers. Even as the Imperial fleet
Also, because those torpedoes have some homing ability to them, which makes them considerably more accurate than Imperial torpedoes. Also, one of the things that I hear a lot of, actually, is that the Tau actually have pretty good battle tactics in that they're supposed to be practical for the most part, like something that people in our world would actually use. It's just that the universe of 40k is so over the top that using quote-unquote normal tactics doesn't exactly cut it.
fleet launched bombers to counter the long-range capability the Tau launched their own escorts. The Tau vessels were trading well with the Imperium, and the Tau themselves felt a great sense of accomplishment at that fact. It was until the Imperium, as well as the Tau, discovered the greatest weakness that the Imperium happily exploited: The Tau had made two grave mistakes. The first being that they underestimated the speeds at which Imperial vessels could move, and the second,
They can't even fight in melee!
a Space Marine strike cruiser, supported by a squadron of Sword-class frigates, drove into the middle of the Tau formation and unleashed their full broadside potential. This was the first in several hard lessons for the Tau, who up until this point were wholly convinced of their forthrightness of thought when it came to battle tactics and ship design. The first thing they learned as the strike cruiser and its frigate escort pulled in their formation was that the Imperial ships were not built with the same standoff engagement style of warfare in mind. The next thing they learned that was broadsides from Imperial vessels hurt. A lot. As the Astarte ships began to lay waste, the Imperium both learned and took advantage of the fact that while the Tau vessels were quite adept at performing standoff engagements, they completely lacked broadside power. It is a testament to the Tau aircast they managed to withdraw from the field at all. 6 of the 7 Tau cruisers managed to escape, albeit heavily damaged, with the 7th cruiser being torn apart by micro-batteries and lances before its crew could abandon ship. Even as the Tau reeled from its first engagement against the Imperium, the Imperial fleet was moving on to the Cycle system.
If I remember correctly, by the way, aren't Tau ships designed, well, at least the actual military ships and not the merchant ships that are fitted for self-defense? And isn't a big thing in the design philosophy that the ships are supposed to be able to funnel a lot of their firepower directly forward, similar to Eldar ships?
7 million Tau lived on an agri-world within the Cycle system, and while the Imperium does like agri-worlds, they decided they would first deal with this infestation of Xenos. Captain Ruman of the Iron Hand Space Marine chapter was given overall command of the ground assault. The first step was to seize an orbital station, which would serve as the command center for the invasion. The Tau, doing anything they could to avoid another direct fleet engagement and not fully realizing what the Imperium would do, opted to evacuate important personnel not only from the station but from the planet itself, something that the Imperials figured out within a short time themselves. The orbital station quickly fell, and just as when the Tau came to Imperial worlds and shared their culture of the greater good with the Imperial citizens, the Iron Hands came to the orbital station and shared their culture of kill it with fire with the Tau. Quickly a landing zone was established, and the 17th Brimlock Dragoons were deployed to the planet. During a disastrous first engagement, the entire 17th was put in danger of being completely wiped out after falling into an ambush at the hands of the heavily mechanized Tau fire warriors. It was being quickly discovered that the Tau, although very young in the cosmic scale, had technology that rivaled and in some cases surpassed the Imperium's altogether. The Tau's battle doctrine for war on the land proved more successful than their void combat doctrines, and as the 17th suffered heavy casualties, the Tau evacuated the more deserving citizens. Coming to the aid of the beleaguered 17th were the Space Marines of the size of the Emperor, as well as the 4th Stormtrooper Company. Rescued and reinforced, the Imperials began to close rapidly on Tau population centers. Upon news of the landing of the 9th Brimlock Fusiliers, the Tau resistance completely fell apart. A scant few shuttles left the surface, even as explosions were set off to deny the Imperium critical technology, and what remained of the Tau military fled the planet, expecting to eventually liberate its people. The Imperium, being the thoughtful empire we all know and love, decided they should alleviate the concerns of the Tau Firecast and relieve them of the burden of liberating the civilian population. In other words, the Imperium killed them all.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Even as
Yeah, because the Imperium does not capture, unless it's for dissection or interrogation, Xenos of any kind. They just exterminate them. Also, yeah, considering that the Imperial Guard quite often uses World War I era battle tactics, it also makes sense that the Tau be effective against them on the ground until, things that defy logic as far as the Tau are concerned begin happening, like a bunch of armored super soldiers raining down from the skies in metal canisters, surviving a landing that should honestly turn anyone inside of that canister into mush.
As the Tau stood in slack-jawed horror at the genocide carried out in the Psychel system, another report came in. As the Tau were being wiped out in the Psychel system, the Imperium had sent a small group of vessels to deal with the nearby Vessel system. The Tau forces in the system prepared to defend its lone inhabited planet, an ice world that held fishery colonies. The Imperium, seeing no real value to the planet, simply pulled into orbit and subjected the planet to low-level bombardment, melting the ice around the colonies and drowning the entire population, turning the ice planet temporarily into a water world. If the cleansing of the Kimbra subsector had shocked the Tau, and the genocide of Psychel had horrified them, then this latest news let the Tau know beyond any shadow of doubt exactly what sort of monster they had provoked. The Tau, who had arrogantly called for a full-scale invasion of the Imperium, now began to wonder exactly what they were thinking, even as they began drawing up plans to defend the world that the Imperium might strike next, knowing now they were in a fight for their species' survival. 5 months later,
This is also, funny enough now I think about it, it in a way kind of like what the Republic experienced in a Fan with Too Much Time's Star Wars versus 40K fanfic that he's been making, where the Star Wars universe has over time realized like what kind of entity the Imperium is in that when it comes to aliens, and they're the only option there is genocide.
the Imperial fleet approached the planet of Prien, which was protected by another Tau orbital station. Figuring this station would fall as easily as the first they had encountered the Psychel system, the fleet's casual approach cost them. As they engaged the station, an array of heavy railguns returned fire, its first volley crippling the Imperial ship Honor of Damocles. Even as the Imperial fleet reeled in shock and broke formation, 11 Tau vessels emerged from behind the planet and engaged. As Imperial escorts attacked the station, the main fleet engaged the Tau. The Tau, to their benefit, learned well from its earlier engagement, focused their fire on the light cruiser Regent Lakashimbi, eventually causing a plasma drive overload. This time it was the Imperials who were learning a painful lesson, and even as the Tau ships took a brutal pounding, the Aircast kept their ships in the fight, even though the loss of the entire Tau fleet quickly became a foregone conclusion. As the escorts closed and began to take the orbital station apart, the Tau launched their final card to play. Imperial Auspex screamed as a Kroot war spear powered up, throwing itself at the troop transports of the Imperial Guard, causing them to scatter. Now the Tau learned a painful lesson. As the flagship of Admiral Jalek, the Blade of Woe went to full power and broke from the Tau vessels to engage the Kroot war spear. They learned that a Kroot war spear, while large, heavily armed, and impressive to look at, could not stand against a Retribution-class battleship. Quickly the war sphere was carved apart, and the last of the Tau vessels was cornered, bracketed, and destroyed. The victory was a Pyrrhic one, as it came at the cost of 4 capital ships and 14 escorts. The lax approach to the station had cost the Imperials badly, and it bought the captains of the Imperium a brand new respect for their opponents. As the Tau fleet drifted in the expanse of the void, the Imperium approached its target, the planet of Death Prime. With the Imperial fleet battered and the expected arrival of another Tau fleet, the Imperium prepared to assault the world immediately. 3 orbital stations hovered over the planet, and not wanting a repeat of the last engagements, the Imperials approached with far more caution, although the Tau had not reinforced these stations as heavily as the one above Prien. They fell easily, and the ground assault commenced almost immediately. For the first time, the full ground force of the Crusade was deployed en masse, even as the Tau planet-based aircraft attempted to contest it. Once landed, however, the Imperial Titans from the Legio Thanatos formed the armored corps of a spearhead, and the Imperium began to drive forwards towards the city of Gelbrunn. Tau resistance came in the form of long-range missile barrages, using spotters in hills and forests, while using jump troops with cloaking fields to protect their spotters, meant to buy time to organize against the Imperial spearhead. Eventually, Kroot warriors, heavy jump troops, and the intelligent use of missile destroyers slowed the Imperium until a front was established, which the Tau held. The Tau's long-range firepower forced the Imperials to dig in, and their night fighting capabilities only enhanced the Tau's defensive position, the latter being negated by Astartes patrols. As Imperial losses continued to grow, more of the Tau military began to arrive on the front, and the leader of the ground forces, General Gauge, concluded that estimations of the Tau military capabilities had been wrong, and he did not have the resources to carry out a large-scale engagement that this was quickly becoming. This issue was compounded by the fears of the fleet captains in orbit, who were convinced another Tau fleet would be arriving soon, even as the Imperials barely felt as if they could protect their troop transports. This would have been negated by reinforcements, which had been promised since the beginning of the Crusade, but none had arrived, and none were en route. Taking all of this in, Inquisitor Grand of the Ordo Xenos suggested an evacuation of the world, followed by the sanction of an exterminatus. The Crusade's War Council devolved into infighting between the Inquisition and the high command of both the Imperial Guard and the Astartes, who viewed the Tau as honorable adversaries. Because, let's face it, if you respect someone, stab them in the face instead of blowing them up from orbit. Am I right? While the argument was happening both on Vox and in orbit, General Grand took action. Imperial artillery opened up on Tau positions even as the Titan, supported by the Brimlock regiments, forced himself against the Tau's right flank, breaking through and trapping the Tau's firecast against the ocean. Within the first few hours of the new offensive, having caught the Tau completely off guard, the Imperial thrust entered Gilbrand. As day turned to night, the two armies brawled in the suburbs of the city, with the Imperium coming only 5 kilometers away from encircling the entirety of the Tau's forces. Overnight, the Tau quit the city, falling back and establishing a new defensive line. Securing the city's starport, General Grand ordered a full evacuation, which the Tau allowed. Even as the Inquisition and Astartes prepared to overrule the order, an astropathic message were being relayed to the fleet. It was a message that recalled old forces to handle a new and much more aggressive threat.
Oh,
The
Tyranids.
space bugs of death! What?
The Tyranids. The Tau did not interfere with the evacuation, and flags of truce were respected by all sides as the two sides entered treaty negotiation. The Damocles Gulf Crusade ended as the Imperial forces were allowed to withdraw, with the Firecast taking back the worlds within its borders that the Imperium had taken. Did the Imperium really win the war? Did the Tau? It's a matter of perspective. The Tau are not extinct, yet they lost billions of lives. The Imperium secured its borders, but only found itself fighting against yet another Xenos threat it could not fully commit to ridding itself of. Why, then, is the Damocles Gulf Crusade considered by many to be so drastically one-sided against the Tau? It's a matter of scale. The commitment of resources and personnel from the Imperial standpoint was almost minimal, with not even 250,000 ground forces at a time fighting in Tau space. Its fleet assets were equally small, with some planets garnering more ships and a garrison force. At the end of the war, the Guard and the Navy had suffered losses stretching into the millions, mostly from the fleet engagements and the losses of several capital ships. And while this might sound painful, these losses wouldn't even cause the most soft-hearted of Administratum personnel to even bat an eye. The primary reasons for the Crusade being called off were the Tyranids, the lack of reinforcements, and the concern of a renewed Tau fleet engagement. A fleet engagement that was not going to happen.
Yep, because, well, the Tau pretty much were already throwing everything they had at the Imperium, so wouldn't really have expected much more, but although, given then the staggered way the Tau probably arrived, given the sluggishness of their warp drives, because they don't have navigators of their own, so they can only make relatively short jumps through the warp, and as well as I've also heard that aside from only making short warp jumps at a time, that their warp engines are also pretty slow. That the probably what they called for originally finally arriving would have been seen by the Imperium as the Tau reinforcing the worlds.
The Tau aircast had barely anything left to attack the Imperials with in the first place, having thrown the majority of their forces against the Imperials at Prayen and losing most of it. Although the aircast had a massive amount of ships, most of them were not militaristic in nature, mainly used for commercial purposes. The fire cast as well during the withdrawal of Imperial forces from the planet did not attack due to the risk it might provoke the Imperials to continue the fight. Propaganda from the Ethereal stated that the Tau could have blockaded the port and the Crusade itself by encircling the planet, which is laughable considering that at that point the Tau barely had any functional warships left. And surrounding a starport to attempt to besiege an army is an exercise in stupidity. What is even more telling is the reactions of the two sides to the results of the war. On the Imperial side, they found themselves against yet another warp-capable species that showed intent of taking over Imperial worlds. To the Tau, this war changed their entire view on the galaxy, radically changed their view on military readiness, and made them painfully aware that they had come within a knife edge of becoming extinct. Due to their policy of the greater good, and their near religious need to expand their territory, it was only a matter of time before they recovered and struck out again, 250 years later, in the Third Sphere expansion. Thank you, and I hope you have enjoyed this lore video. I will catch you guys next time.
There's also, like with reference to it, the fact that this conflict also led to the Core Orvesh Initiative, which, if I remember correctly, was the Tau learning from the Damocles Gulf Crusade, and their, the experience of fighting Imperial warships, and putting a ton of resources into upgrading their navy, both in terms of size and the actual capabilities of their ships, in an attempt to match the Imperium, which never going to happen due to the sheer number of Imperial ships due to the scale difference, but also the fact that some of those Dark Age ships that have been laying around for over 10,000 years that the Imperium has are like I think it was called the Esperanza. Those ones can do some scary things. But yeah, I definitely enjoyed watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching with me. Yeah, definitely check out Old Man's content if you aren't doing so already. And if you enjoyed watching the reaction, I'd appreciate if you like, comment, and subscribe. But until next time, ta-ta!